This infogram portrays the key steps in building a risk scorecard. Typically, you're going to start off with a risk register that has been developed by interviewing managers in your organization to identify the risks you need to contend with. Now, some organizations are concerned that that process may in fact blindside you against some risks, because obviously the interviews only reveal those risks that the executives have been exposed to or can remember. So an interesting approach is actually to start off with a risk category checklist. So there are many frameworks you can use, such as COSO or COBIT or ITIL, that have checklists of types of risks. And from this, you can create a generic list of risks that encompass all organizations or all organizations in your industry or even just your function. And if you can combine that with your strategy, you can get an interesting observation. So your strategy you might be able to find in things like shareholder communications, maybe internal communications from the leadership team, or even things like your business monthly reports and your annual report. You can use those to create what's called a strategy map, where you identify your key strategic objectives, their relationship to each other, and their relative priority for this year. And if you combine those two things, your strategy and those risk categories, you can begin to create what we call a risk category profile. Across this table, we've listed those risk categories across the top, and we evaluate them for likelihood and impact and begin to see a footprint of where risk occurs. Let me show you. So, for example, in this financial perspective, using the balanced scorecard view and the risk category called cost, this organization suggests there's a likelihood of 4 that we might have risks in this area. And if we score the impact across objectives, we can identify individual risk areas that we're concerned with. We can also add down the columns to begin to determine the quantity of risks relative to each of those risk categories. Or in fact, we can add up across the strategic objectives to see what is risk by strategic objective. Regardless, this gives you an overall view of where risks are occurring across those categories. Now, you can take that input and use that in combination with that existing risk register we looked at before, and interviewing your leadership team to now come up with a refreshed risk register. Now, I open by saying some organizations are fortunate enough to be able to start here. So, if we take that refreshed risk register, what we should be able to do is combine that with our strategic priorities to be able to do a strategic risk assessment. Let's take a look at that. That strategic risk assessment allows us to look at now the individual risk elements in a sort of a standard format. We're going to take a look at what is the likelihood of those risks to happen. But now we're going to take a look at the impact by strategic objective. In other words, we're not scoring it just 1 to 5 across all the strategy. We're being more precise. And this precision allows us to get a much more accurate score of where the risk is occurring in the organization. This chart allows us to produce a standard, for example, risk scatter diagram, where we chart the likelihood on the left and the strategic impact across the bottom. But you'll now see the strategic impact is no longer ranked from 1 to 5, but 1 to whatever the highest value of strategic impact is. And it's based on the specific priorities of those objectives for this year. Now, this chart can be used in a number of other ways beyond your traditional risk approach. For example, scenario planning. If you laid down alternate weightings for those strategic objectives, these dots would move across the sheet and give us a view of where risk lies in those different scenarios. Regardless, this more accurate view of risk, if we combine that with the performance measures from your balanced scorecard, allow us to build the risk scorecard. Now, the risk scorecard allows us to take a very predictive look at risk and their impact. Let's take a close look at what that can do for us. So the components inside the risk scorecard are as follows. First, this signal strength icon represents for us the impact of that risk against that strategic objective. The icon is the leading indicator for whether that risk is occurring. And then finally, we can get a graphical view of that weighted risk level. Now what we're looking at really with that weighted risk level is the impact times the weighting times the score of the actual performance. And the bigger the bar is, the more risk which is occurring at this point in time in the organization. Well, then we can add it down the column to give us an overall risk likelihood from that risk element. Or, of course, we could add it up across the chart to tell us both the strategic and absolute risk that's occurring in the organization. So the risk scorecard gives us a very powerful tool for taking a detailed look at risk. Now, we can summarize those overall results into a risk heat diagram that can be used for external stakeholders or board of directors members. So this overall approach allows us to build a strategic risk scorecard and a number of other deliverables in the interim that are important parts of effective risk management. Now, the tools and the cloud software to build this are available to you for free at riskscorecard.net, along with more detailed instructional webinars and tools to help you build out your risk scorecard.